Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We are so happy to have you here today for our summer, almost summer, late spring, practically summer guest speaker. We don't normally do these programs this time of year, so we're really excited though because we made an exception when we found out that Bruce's book existed and all that. So I want to welcome you. I'm Julie Zazada, I'm the Executive Director here at the Cedar Lake Historical Association. Happy to have you here on this very rainy day. Sort of been a steamboat day, and alas, it is not, but we're here and we're still going to have a wonderful time together. So before we get started, before I turn it over to our author, I just want to give you a couple of announcements. Upcoming events, that kind of thing. So the first one, in case you couldn't smell it on your way in, the dining room at Lassen's Resort is open today, so it is just only our second day of operation. This is a brand new program, an experience that we are offering here at Lassen's. Every Wednesday, we will have full service dining experience for you all summer long. So we have starting at 12 in the afternoon all the way till last seating at 7 p.m. at night. The menu is amazing. A lot of us in this room have already been tasting all the different dishes, and we are really excited about this partnership that has developed with Remix Catering. So hopefully you all have time to make an appointment. You don't need a reservation, but just come on in and have lunch with us and taste all these amazing food and support Remix and supporting the museum as well, but just by spreading the word and letting people know that this is here now, that they have this option. On Saturday, July 5th, this is during Summerfest, we will be debuting the Captain Andrew W. Laud Heroes Gallery Wall of Honor. That's going to be a new permanent exhibit here at the museum, and that is meant for all of us to be able to honor the servicemen and women who we consider to be the heroes in our lives. So this is not necessarily a memorial wall. This can be somebody who's still actively serving or someone still alive. It just, you can have a plaque made. It requires a $75 donation. Now on July 5th, we've already taken all of the first batch of names, so you'll be able to just come and witness the unveiling on July 5th. But then going forward, we will continue to take people's donations and their information to create plaques going forward. This will be a permanent exhibit right here in the museum. So I want to invite you to that. Saturday, July 5th, the family, Andrew Laud's family, will be here helping us kick off and unveil this exhibit. And also, since it's America's 250 this year, we decided we're going to read the Declaration of Independence as well. Technically, the nation is going to be reading it on July 8th. It would be 5 p.m. Central, but there's no market. There's not really much going on, so we thought, while we're all together during Summerfest, let's go ahead and read that together as part of the program when we debut Andrew's Memorial or Heroes Gallery Wall of Honor. So we'll do that, and then there'll be a little reception as well. So and then the last thing was to share is that Speakeasy tickets for our Speakeasy Summer Social Fundraiser are on sale already. It's literally an end of summer party for us, and we have a really interesting new act that we're going to bring out this year to get that whole Speakeasy vibe going, and dance lessons and the music and the costumes, which costumes are optional, but if you wear one, it's a lot more fun. So the tickets are on sale already. Why don't you just kind of plant that seed in your head? If you want to come out and join us, it's $80 per person. Members get $10 discount at any time. We did away with the early bird, and we're giving that member discount all the time. So hopefully we'll see you at some of those programs. Now, I want to turn it over to our author, Bruce Koptek. We, as you know, have been running the Alabama #4 converted lifeboat as Steamer Dewey for these past 6 years. Well, lo and behold, Bruce has written a book all about Great Lakes steamship cruising, and when we discovered this book, well, I was particularly excited to learn that this book existed and that there's information about the Alabama, but then as well as the entire experience that people were having out on the Great Lakes during this era. So he is here today to talk about his book and answer our questions for you, like I said, at the end of the program. So if you would all please help me welcome Bruce.
Thank you very much. I know that Julie is a very enthusiastic person, and that's how she gets things done. But I also want to share the enthusiasm that you've actually come out to listen to me talk here. So the whole point is that you could do anything on a rainy day like this. It's not the best day in the world, but you chose to come, and I really, truly appreciate that. So without too much let's get started here. I want to talk about why this book exists and why this whole topic, not even beyond the book, is as important as it is. because history is a great thing, and I've built a love of history, but there are things people don't know. I come from Detroit. I was born and raised there. My dad was in the Navy. We went down to the river to watch the boats. That's one of the things I did as a kid with my dad and my brother and sister and mom. And so I always saw these things. And we went to the museum there and I saw other stuff. And I knew that somewhere in the past, somewhere the information was all around about these giant ships that looked completely like the Titanic. And I will show you a picture of what I mean as this presentation goes on. But the best thing that I've been able to find, and so this is a history that I'm assuming most of you don't know. If I started naming off things like City of Detroit 3 and C&B and the Keewatin and the Assiniboia, you would not know those names because those are the names of ships that took passengers all over the Great Lakes for a large part of the 20th century and much beyond. So I want to go back and talk first about to get settled the story of the Alabama and talk about some of the basics of this steamship travel in the Great Lakes and go on. First, what I have though is very nice, it's old, it's fuzzy, but it's a video of the SS C&B, which is a 4-stacked, 500-foot long steamship paddle wheel passenger ship that originally was built to take people from Cleveland to Buffalo and back, but it became a white elephant on that route in the 20s and 30s, but gained success as a cruise ship. So it came all the way to Chicago as a cruise ship, especially during 1933 when the Century of Progress exhibition was held. Many people from Cleveland or Buffalo found that a great way to go to Chicago on the boat and have a good time dancing and whatnot on there. So this, in essence, is just an idea of how majestic these things were as they went up and down the Great Lakes. So in this case, that is the SS C&B, a paddle wheel, 500-foot long paddle wheel steamer with 4 stacks, came to Detroit to take people that worked for Ford, the dealerships, the mechanics, the salesmen, were taken on an excursion by the Ford Motor Company in Detroit, when Detroit was the powerhouse of the world as far as automobile production went. So you can see how big that thing was. I always liken it almost to some giant sea monster flowing up. But here we're in Belle Isle Park in Detroit, looking as the steamer goes down the ship channel on the north side of Belle Isle there. And magnificent, large, it had 600 and some cabins for people. They could take another probably 1,000 people that if they were going on an overnight trip could just sit in the lounge. Dining room, a pub that looked like an old English pub in the very tail of the ship. Ballroom, ladies' lounge, and so on and so forth. All those things, I did intensive research for 3 years and I came up with the idea for a book that told that history. And of course, along with the book goes the lecture, which we're at. Now, the Great Lakes were formed at the end of the Ice Age. And there were prehistoric riverbeds that basically went along the routes of Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and of course to what's now the St. Lawrence River leading out to the ocean. So they're very old. They are the largest really natural asset that we have in this region, the whole Great Lakes Basin. And it's the largest body of fresh water anywhere on the earth if you take the lakes all together. Even Lake Baikal in Russia is not that big, which is a giant, almost a sea. So these things, these lakes, if you're on one side, the lakes are a barrier to get to the other side, obviously. Man's ingenuity from the time of the Native Americans that were here, through the Jesuit missionaries that came, through the businessmen that developed the business over years, turned that barrier into a connector. And so was able to connect people. So there's a human part of the whole story as well, which I really like to do. As you can see here, there's the lakes, the current states that are around them. You can probably pinpoint our own location there. And also you can take a look at the depths and the fact that really only Lakes Michigan, Huron, and Erie are at the same level. So some of the very largest of these steamships could not get into Lake Ontario and could not get into Lake Superior because we have the St. Mary's Rapids between the United States, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Canada there. And we also have the Welland Canal that connects bypasses Niagara Falls and the sheer drop of Niagara Falls there.
Yeah.
So I was talking about the lake levels, that even some of the largest of these ships could not make it through the Welland Canal at the time. That all changed in 1959 when the St. Lawrence Seaway opened, and it changed the nature of the St. Lawrence River and caused, for international trade, caused those locks all to be made bigger so that large freight ships could go in. Now, if that's the basis of the lake, I often ask, when you study history, who really cares? Who cares? This is exactly what I was talking about. That is the skyline of Detroit, probably around 1930, and where the water meets the buildings is the wharf, and there are 3 of those giant liners right there on the wharf. You won't see anything like that today. We've got a little Princess excursion boat or something like that. So it just, and that's not even the GM building anymore. They're moving. Yeah. So anyway, it's a remarkable image to me with those beautiful steamships located there. And in this picture, it's probably in the middle of the day, and the steamboats are just, they're just waiting for somebody to get on so that they can go on their trips to Cleveland, Buffalo, or up, in that one case, to Mackinac and back down to Chicago on every 3rd day. You know, when I say who cares, this is something that people actually used, right? It was a part of people's lives. I had an uncle that went to Buffalo on the greater Detroit or greater Buffalo one time and said that it was a really nice trip. In the cities, you could see Navy Pier in Chicago. That was a potential docking place. The Goodrich lines used that for many years, but then when the D&C line came to Chicago, they used Navy Pier. Many people here will remember 2 ships on the Great Lakes called the North American and South American of the Georgian Bay Line, and those were originally headquartered in Chicago, but they docked mostly down on the Chicago River at the foot of Michigan Avenue. This is the 9th Street Pier in Cleveland, and here are those North American and South American Park. Those were a little bit different. They were built as cruise ships and they had propellers as opposed to paddle wheels. But people utilize this transportation, so it's important. Here again is a picture of Detroit with all the different ships along the wharf and aerial photograph. I'm guessing this one is more early it would have to still be in the 40s sometime, post-war, maybe 46. But these 2 are ferry boats that took us to our famous Boblo amusement park. They're gone now. They still exist, but one burned. They're just in an awful state. And every Sunday, my dad and Mom would take us down to this little terminal there, and not every Sunday, every summer on a Sunday that was chosen, we'd go to church and we'd come down and go to Boblo and spend the day at the amusement park. An experience that nobody can have anymore because it just didn't work out given cultural things. Who cares? My mom cares, because that was the Tajmo, an excursion boat, not a ferry, but it would go from Toledo all the way up to Port Huron, stopping on Harson's Island in the St. Clair River, and there was an amusement park there too. So my mother, she had been on that as a child, so I care about her past and what formed her as a person. So she was on that one. One of my closest friends sent me this picture, and he's standing right there as a young boy. He's with his family because they're wishing their aunt and uncle off on a Great Lakes cruise on the SS South American there. So everybody came down to the dock to wave goodbye and wave at the ship as it left, and that was a big thing. You see that in older movies, the confetti flowing and all that. We had that at all these terminals in our cities at one time. And then there's this lady, Beatrice Bolte, who I only met through a lady whose husband worked with my wife. And she said, my grandmother used to tell me about this cruise she took when she got out of high school. And she said, I love talking to my grandmother, but I was just terrified for her that as a 17 or 18-year-old girl, she got out of high school, and her parents let her go on a cruise from Detroit to Buffalo, back through Detroit to Mackinac, all the way to Duluth, Minnesota, and back to Detroit, stopping at ports and things like that. And I said, weren't you afraid? Weren't you afraid of the ship? Weren't you afraid of the men that were on board that maybe wouldn't be kind to you? And the grandmother said, no, there was nothing to worry. It was a wonderful experience. I'm so glad I did it. And the captain knew who we were, and he told my parents, don't worry a thing. Once they're on our ship, they're our responsibility. We'll take care of them. And she said they did. The crew couldn't have been nicer. The captain always checked on things. There was always somebody escorting us when we got off the ship that we knew would take care of us. So great thing is she left behind a photo album of her whole trip too. So I was able to use some of those photos in the book showing Beatrice Bolte later married in Prignitz, in her very experience on one of the fabulous luxury liners of the Great Lakes. So how did this all come about? Well, it came about when immigrants were coming to New York. In those days, in the 1840s, the steamship was already developed in a very rudimentary way, but there were no travel agencies, there was no Travelocity or Orbits or anything like that. Even communication would have to be by wire, maybe, by telegraph. So once you arrived in New York City, there was no system to get you to Chicago, which was the railroad hub of the world. If you were going anywhere west, you want to get to Chicago and go that way. So you would arrive and you'd have to find a steamship that would take you up the Hudson River to Albany.
Yep.
And all that is that you would go to the dock and say, who's going to Albany? And the captain would come out and say, yeah, we are, but like in 4 hours. So you'd have to wait, you'd have to agree on a price with them, negotiate a price and do it. Well, you got to Albany, there's no more steamships, now you're going to go on the Erie Canal on a canal boat. So there you go to the terminus of the Erie Canal, negotiate again for another ticket to get to Buffalo. From there, you can get on a steamship to Cleveland, because in the 1840s or so, there was no steamship that was capable of carrying passengers, a good number of passengers, and the amount of coal it took to get from, it's kind of like our electric cars. You can't, your charge only lasts so long, your fuel only lasts so long, and then you can get to Cleveland. Again, Cleveland, on the docks, negotiate for a trip to Detroit on a ship. Once you're on the, in Detroit, Michigan had one of the very early railroads under construction. It didn't get all the way to Chicago, but it worked its way from Detroit to Ann Arbor to Jackson to Battle Creek to Kalamazoo and all the way across to New Buffalo at the very end, not far from here, right, at the very end of Michigan there. And New Buffalo was meant to be a big port city because this is where everything was going to come and then take a ship across Lake Michigan to Chicago. So that was the last link there. That really didn't happen because eventually the railroad made it around the lake and you could take one train from Detroit to Chicago and then get on another train, go anywhere you want. So that was the very early thing. Not the safest way to travel because these ships were fraught with trouble, as Ted would know that it's not the easiest thing in the world to operate a steamship. Luckily these ships had crews of engineers and people that kept them running, but it was often, tenuous, I would say. So some of the earliest ones that were on the Michigan Central eventually realized that it would be good to have a steamship service from Cleveland to Buffalo to drop passengers off and get on their trains. It drove business. Like the Monon Railway here built a station at Cedar Lake because they had facilities there and they could keep their trains busy on a day basis. People coming from Chicago and back could spend an afternoon on the lake and go back to Chicago. So all these transportation systems thought together. So at one point there was a very loosely organized entity called the Michigan Central Steamship Line that took people from Cleveland to Buffalo. Those are the first couple of ships. They were called the Southerner and the May Queen. And you can see on top of these boats, there's something right there that kind of looks like a diamond that's on top of there too. That was called a walking beam. So the early steam engine, that's a sign of an old, inefficient ship. Because the early steam engines, they were vertical, so the piston would just go up and down. But you've got to turn the paddle wheels of that thing around like this. So a connector rod would go up to that walking beam, and it would be connected to another rod that would go down back through the ship, and that was able to crank the axle or the crankshaft that turned the paddle wheels that were on these ships. The paddle wheeler was considered the most efficient, best way to travel on the Great Lakes because the paddles were on the sides, and the whole structure of the boat eventually went over that, so the decks could be wide, so they could have more rows of cabins on the boat, carry more people. But if you can imagine that motion of the piston doing this, and that walking beam, actually while the boat was going, oscillated like this. It caused vibration, it was inefficient, it took away a lot of the energy that by the time it got to the paddle wheels, it wasn't a great system. So that needed innovation. In 1867 in Michigan, you were able to form a corporation that transported people by water. So the Detroit and Cleveland Steam Navigation Company was founded by the captains of these ships to be a corporation that could provide that service. And after several years of the Michigan Central operation, they had gone through ships. Now all these ships were wooden hulled. is, and anybody knows, you put wood in the water, I don't care how well it's painted, whatever, it's going to rot. So the actual longevity of the boats was not long. They would, almost every season would change another one. The steam engines were made out of metal and they lasted longer. So you could have a rotted boat, but take the steam engine out and put it in a new hull and save money that way to build more ships. But just about a month after that company was formed, maybe a year and a month or something, I'm not quite sure of the dates, it's in the book, one of their newer ships was called the Morning Star. And that ship left Cleveland for Detroit, and in the middle of the night, not far off of Cleveland, because it was an overnight trip, a schooner loaded with lumber from the north down to, to go to east to build frame houses or whatever, rammed into the paddle wheel of that ship. The schooner's lights were disabled. They didn't have proper lighting on them, so the captain of the Morning Star never saw them. And it rammed them in the side at the paddle wheel, and so the engine kept running, and the schooner literally bashed the Morning Star apart. Heavy loss of life, and I believe that at this point the DNC company said, we don't want to do it this way. This is not. So after that tragedy, a lot of people were saved. They don't know how many people died because you had people that had reserved cabins, but you also had walk-ons. They don't know how many walk-ons were ever on there. People were, people hang on to a door floated up in Cleveland later in the day, the next day, and things like that. So kind of a tragic story, but that's really at the very beginning of this. And then 10 years later, they acquired this much larger ship called the R.N. Rice, and it was their flagship. It was toasted in the newspapers as so great. But while it was waiting to take on passengers in Detroit, a fire started, and the whole superstructure burned off. So they thought, well, we're going to put it in dry dock, and we're going to fix the top, and we'll be good to go. But when they got in the dry dock, everything's rotted. The hull was useless. So at that point, people in the management said, we've got to gain capital to be able to build better ships. And the only way they could do that was by assessing the stockholders, $5 a share. And the stockholders were like, no, we're done with this. We don't want to bother anymore. Came this gentleman, James McMillan, who came from Hamilton, Ontario, and was an industrialist. He owned the biggest railroad car-making factory in the world. It was in Detroit. He built the rails for railroads and forged those. He also had investments in railroads, including the Michigan Central and some in the Upper Peninsula. And then he created railroad wheels. They were great industrialists in Michigan. He became a senator. And in those days, senators were appointed by the legislature, not elected. And he moved to Washington, D.C. after his involvement with the DNC. And he was the person that put the L'Enfant plan of Washington, D.C. that you see with the boulevards and the memorials and things all lined up in angles and squares and circles and all that. It was designed by a Frenchman in the 1700s, but he put it into effect. He built the roads and made sure the zoning was right for the buildings for Washington to look as it did. But he was a great businessman. His whole family became a dynasty that ran that company until 1947. This is the old DNC terminal in Detroit, and it was called the Wayne Pavilion because this was the Wayne Hotel in Mineral Baths. There was a health spring actually found right there on the edge of the river, which is kind of unbelievable. Their freight warehouse was there, but this was the tower of the Michigan Central Station in Detroit. So that was an early intermodal system because you could go, get in on a ship, stay overnight in a hotel if you had a connection to make that wasn't right away, or you could just walk down the street with your luggage to the Michigan Central Station and get yourself to Chicago. So that's the type of transfer that happened along these lines. The other person that's important in this whole story is Frank Kirby, who was a genius naval designer that is very famous, and through his father eventually came to own and work at the Detroit Dry Dock Company, which is a large shipyard in Detroit. Parts of this still exist. It's a state park now with a marina, and one of the old engine house has been turned into a rec center. But that really launched so many great ships. You can see the slips with ships either being built or older schooners and that being repaired, their hulls being repaired there. And so, of course, these two guys really brought innovation to the whole steamship thing that affected Chicago and Indiana and all that. They started to build their own ships with that. When that $5 thing didn't go over well with the stockholders, McMillan came in and just paid for it all because he was rich. And it was a slow kind of profit-building thing, but by the 1920s, when they built their largest ships, they just built it right out of their pocket. They didn't need financing because they had made so much money with ships like the City of Cleveland, too, which had a steel hull, which was one of the new ideas, and the city of Detroit too, which was the flagship up until these really big luxury liners were built. And they operated according to the highest standards of innovation and of safety. The D&C line was very different from the Goodrich company on Lake Michigan, which I'm going to talk about. Never lost a passenger during all that time on one of its ships due to a fire, an accident, a sinking, or anything like that. And it was because of Frank Kirby's designs and his insistence upon fire protection on the ships and all that. One of the other innovations on all paddle wheel ships was the feathering paddle wheel. So the early ships would just have a paddle that went around a circle. What this did was it had hinged buckets on it that were tied to another, an off-axis circle that caused that bucket to hit the water and scoop it up and shoot it out behind. That made the ship more efficient and faster. Now this Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company had a very far-flung network. In 1925 it started its route from Mackinac down to Chicago, so you could, every third day a ship left Detroit and went up Lake Huron, stopped at Mackinac and went down to Chicago, and you could do a nice cruise. If you wanted to spend a couple days in Chicago, you could just pick up one of the other ships going back. Same thing with Mackinac. It stopped there for several hours if you just wanted a day trip, but then you could stay until the next boat came by and continued your vacation like that. In 1902, the D&C line came up with what I consider really there were predecessors that were sort of getting there, but it was really one of the very first of what we call these fabulous luxury liners of the Great Lakes. They were sleek, they were large at 365 feet long. The Alabama was 272 feet long, so it's very large. Carried a lot of passengers. I think there were 300 and some cabins, and they were meant to take that Buffalo trip back and forth. They were already making money on the Cleveland line, and another businessman was hinting about doing the Buffalo line. I said, let's do it because we're not going to let him take first place. So really the eastern states and the western states were the first of these fabulous luxury liners. In 1908, the company wanted to replace the ships on the Cleveland line then, and they built the City of Cleveland 3. Now, that was a pretty magnificent ship. It was over 400 feet long. In the newspapers of the time, there was 10 pages of cutaway views and pictures and acclamations about the people that were involved in the design, or the Detroit firms that furnished the furniture and the wood carvings and all that stuff. It was a beautiful, beautiful ship, but it burned in 1907 right at that Detroit dry dock. So the hull was steel, the engine was steel, but it was a delay of 1 year before the ship could actually run in the public. All the artwork, all the murals and all that were lost in that fire. It had to be redone. A couple of years later, they needed a running mate for that, so that was the flagship of the D&C line, which was called the City of Detroit 3. Really a favorite ship, almost 500 feet long, 3 stacks. Everybody knew the City of Detroit, and one of the, I don't go into here because we're talking more about Goodrich and all that, but it had these beautiful interiors, and one of the interiors, which was called the Gothic Room, that has this beautiful, sumptuous wood carving based on Strawberry Hill House on the outskirts of London. That room was dismantled before the scrapping in 1956, taken to a farm in Ohio where it sat, because the person that bought it while the ship was being scrapped wanted to open a restaurant with that as the decor. Well, he passed away, and by 1960, his heirs wanted to get rid of everything. So much like this museum, you have to have supporters and you have to have everything going. They were able to get the Daughters of the American Revolution to find money and do a fundraising so that they could install the Gothic Room back in our Dawson Great Lakes Museum. And it's there in all of its splendor. There's pictures in the book and the whole story about that came about. In 1925, they built these 2 largest, the Greater Detroit and Greater Buffalo. The interior designer was an architect by the name of Louis O. Kyle. He was German, and obviously he had a flair for woodwork design and all that, because German wood carving. That's the interior of the City of Cleveland 2. So you could walk in on the lowest level here. If you had tickets for a cabin, you went up the stairs, and there were galleries of cabins on there. But this is called the Grand Salon. You can see the ceiling was very ornate with paintings. It's a little washed out there because there was natural light at the top. So from a darkened part in the bottom of the ship, everything got lighter as you went up, a little bit like a cathedral. I mean, just imagine that thing floating down the lakes, and you're inside of that, and you don't even know. You think you're in a grand hotel or something on that order. The City of Detroit 3 had a larger but equally beautiful, more refined interior with custom lamp fixtures and everything like that. And this was the Gothic room, which was the smoking room on the top of that steamer. And that was the famous thing. You can see all the woodworking. You can see a stained glass panel that shows LaSalle stepping onto American soil in Michigan for the first time. And he later came down through Chicago, down the Mississippi River, and claimed what became the Louisiana Purchase for. That was in the 1500s. His ship that he originally came on was lost in Lake Superior, either somewhere in Lake Huron or Lake Michigan. Nobody knows where it is. But he got off and took a canoe down the Mississippi River, actually. That's the Gothic room in the Dawson Great Lakes Museum today. And the stained glass windows have been preserved, and instead of seats for playing cards, the Gothic room had a fireplace. It had a full pipe organ in it so that an organ player could entertain people. They're obviously scaled to the size of the room, not Notre Dame de Paris, but you can just see the beautiful woodwork in there. That it's so amazing that was saved, right, for people. If you're ever in the Detroit area, I would recommend that. The last two ships built by the D&C line, Lewis Kyle had passed away. They were designed by Kirby, but W&J Sloan Company of New York, who was the furnisher to all of the Newport mansions and this sort of thing, they did the interior design for that ship. It was based on the Villa Madama in Rome, all the frescoes and all that design there. So it really was quite a way to go, I'd say. And the experience, you know, there were deck games. They had many of these ships. I think even the Goodrich ones did. They would have a trumpet, a bugle player or something would play. Actually, on the D&C line, they played on the boats to Buffalo. They played Shuffling Off to Buffalo, while people took a mile long. It was so many times around the deck to get a mile. So if you went on one of these ships, you could get some exercise by doing a mile walk around the decks, being led by a band. But of course, they had pubs, they had social spaces, cabins, and all that kind of stuff, so people could just enjoy it. They talked a lot about enjoying fresh lake air. I'm not so sure about a coal-fired steamboat and all the soot, how that mingled, but even they featured fish in their restaurants, so the menus looked like a cutout fish to show that kind of thing. The mascot of the D&C line was a frog, because when the frogs started to chirp in the spring, the ice had melted and meant that the shipping season, these were all, except for Goodrich, all these were seasonal operations. So just a really incredible, I would think anybody's ever been on a cruise or that, you would know what the experience was here. Goodrich, at the same time in the 1850s, was founded by Captain Alfred Goodrich, and he had been born in Buffalo, moved with his family to New Buffalo, but all his life he was around the water and around ships and that. So he was at that New Buffalo terminus where these trains were coming in and the ships were taking people across Lake Michigan. So he said, I want to be a captain. Was able to become a captain, but what he really wanted was his own line that he himself could control. And the extent of the Goodrich lines was based in Chicago. Their main business was the route across Lake Michigan to Grand Haven, Muskegon, Holland, South Haven. They eventually merged with the Graham and Morton Company, which was the steamship line really out of St. Joseph and Benton Harbor there. And in the 20s, the two lines merged, and it was kind of like Studebaker merging with Packard. They both bought each other down as a result of that merger. But here is the SS Alabama. That was their flagship. Was built in 1909. It was launched in 1909, came into service in 1910. I think this image shows it as a little bit more sleek and ocean liner-esque than it really was. They also had a cruise route up to Mackinac Island from Chicago and stopping all over the Door Peninsula and things like that, so that was popular. And an express route between Milwaukee and Chicago. So you could take either a day or a night boat to Milwaukee if you lived in Chicago on the Goodrich line. They also owned the famous whaleback steamer, Christopher Columbus. And it was a design of a Scottish engineer that had the hull of the boat was like a flotation device, almost like a lifeboat, or almost like a life jacket in and of itself, and then the superstructure sat on top of that. It was only a day boat. It was built as an experiment to take people from Chicago to the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. And then when that was over, it ran to Milwaukee on excursions, and it was purchased by the Goodrich lines. So that was their day boat between Chicago and Milwaukee. But it was fast, it was innovative, it was really different. And people, there's probably still some people, because it went out of service in the 30s, maybe there's people in Chicago that still remember being on it. If not, there's certainly newspaper accounts, some of which I've quoted in the book. But that's Albert E. Goodrich, the captain, and that he built this whole network. Now the problem is, he had a couple of ideas. He didn't think that winter should stop cross-lake traffic. And all of these boats that went on those routes, they were passenger ships, but they did carry express cargo, which means they were the Federal Express of their day. You could take a package down to the dock, and they would register it, put it on the boat, and it would arrive in Muskegon the next day. Coming from Michigan, that whole western part of Michigan is called the fruit belt. So cargoes of apples, all kind of fruit came to the west where they were taken by train to other parts of the country or right to Chicago itself. So it was a good money maker for him, but he was a little bit of a wheeler dealer. He bought and sold ships. If something wasn't quite right, they'd fix it, they'd kind of duct tape it rather than buy new ships. Even when the steel-hulled ships of the D&C were considered the finest, Goodrich still had wooden-hulled ships. And so when the last wooden-hulled one was getting ready to rot and sink, they just put steel plating on the outside of it and called it good. Unfortunately, early in this time, with this as the philosophy, there were a great number of very terrible shipwrecks that Goodrich... I read a book in preparation for writing my book. It was called Red Stacks on the Horizon. It was by a Chicago author that loved the Goodrich line. Spoke very highly of it, but some of the facts speak a little bit differently. In 1863, Goodrich ventured into Lake Superior, and one of his ships left for an overnight run to Sault Ste. Marie from Ontonagon, kind of where my wife's family is from, across above the Keweenaw Peninsula and down east and then into Lake Michigan down to Chicago. But in the middle of the night after they left Ontonagon, a gale came up. The ship was wrecked, and this storm was that bad. One man survived, and he was an employee of the ship, wound up on the shore where some Native Americans took him to the biggest city so he could get medical help. But it was a terrible, terrible disaster. Only one person survived. Then in 1868, the Goodrich ship that served Milwaukee and Chicago was called the Seabird. And you can see that these are that older type with the walking beam on. So they were early, but the Seabird had a porter on board who was just on board to clean up. Maybe, I don't know if they even served drinks to passengers in the lounge. So at night, when everybody had gone to bed, he took the hot coals from the stove and threw them overboard, except the wind was blowing this way. And the deck below with the cargo on it was loaded with bales of what we would call, I've heard it called Excelsior. It's just packing material. It's shredded paper. That went up like a light. Only two people that jumped off and clung to a door were able to make it ashore on it. So we had, if you want to talk shipwrecks, that one at least two people survived out of probably 100 or so on the boat. And that was right, you could see it from the shore of Lake Michigan, the northern suburbs of Chicago. You could see that. In 1880, terrible disaster on Lake Michigan, a ship named the Alpena left Grand Haven, where I have relatives, to go to Chicago. It left on a kind of decent October night, but by the time it got into the lake, a horrible storm came up. So there were no radio communications at that time. A captain reported seeing the Alpena near Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is all the way on the other side of Lake Michigan. Later in the night, another captain reported seeing it on its back with its paddle wheels going in the air, again close to the Michigan side. So the storm blew it back. The next morning, the deck was covered with crates of apples that were heading west. It was the fall, right? The apple harvest had come. Apples started washing up, and the beach looked red because it was bobbing with apples. Bodies started washing up. Debris washed up, so much so that in Grand Haven, the beach that had another name, like Michigan Beach or something, became known for many years after that as Alpena Beach, because parts of the Alpena were even always showing up. And something like 15 years later, the paddle box with the name of the ship, parts of it intact, washed up on the beach. So it had been in the lake or bobbing around for 15 years before it actually hit the same beach where the shipwreck. Nobody made it through that one. So, and you can imagine the terrible thing that the ship was upside down with the paddle wheels still running. It really was beaten up by the storm there. So there was a risk involved in that sort of thing. Now, some of the famous Goodrich liners, for instance, this was their whole fleet in 1916. They had bought a lot of boats. or actually this is later, this maybe 1926. They had the ships of the Graham and Morton line in there as well. Typically a Goodrich ship was not a paddle wheeler, there was a propeller driven ship, but the Graham and Morton had on the route from Michigan City to Chicago, and then had paddle wheelers. So they merged it all together and did what they could with that bunch. Neither company was making a lot of money when they merged. A very innovative, newer ship was the first steel-hulled ship built by the Goodrich Line, which was the Virginia in 1892. It was built in Cleveland and designed by the shipyard in Cleveland's Globe Iron Company's designer. So it was not a curvy ship. The Carolina was a boat that Goodrich bought that was launched in Philadelphia, worked what was called the Fall River line in saltwater from Fall River, Massachusetts to New York, and they had problems. That line was retired. It was used as a naval ship in the Spanish-American War, and then came back to Goodrich. It came back to Lake Michigan, and Goodrich eventually bought it, and it served the cruise route up to Mackinac that had. And you see that these all have a similar look. So the Alabama was really an extension of that. Of course, the Alabama was launched, like I said, in 1910. Same thing, the red and black stacks were signatures that people noticed. Kind of stout, they weren't terribly big ships, but they got the job done and people respected them. And of course the line promoted the Alabama as their flagship in all cases there with this really nice illustration of this modern ship. And here's all the lifeboats on there, count 1, 2, 3, 4, that may be yours there. But the Alabama had nice wood paneled interiors that people could travel in, had restaurant facilities. Some of the earlier Goodrich ships were not maybe as private as the later ones or the DNC liners that had cabins to sleep in. They offered cabins at a higher price, but it was more like a train, a lot of it was more like a train berth where the beds were along the wall and you draw the curtains and go there. But by the time the Alabama came, it was all cabins for passengers, and that allowed the Alabama to live on long after Goodrich went out of business in 1932. So this is after 1932, a company bought Alabama and they tried to run it on its original line across Lake Michigan. That was not successful. So the Georgian Bay line that offered these cruises all through the Great Lakes bought the Alabama as an extra ship. So the cruise line that Georgian Bay line had, starting from Buffalo, would head westward, and at Sault Ste. Marie it would split. You could either your cruise would either take you to Duluth or it would take you down to Chicago. Well, they had a lot of business on the Chicago route, so they operated both the North American and the South American, but the Alabama, which retained its name under their ownership, went to Duluth for a couple of seasons. Unfortunately, the Alabama was slower than those other two ships. It was smaller, so it was hard to figure the number of cabins that were needed and then the staffing on it and everything. So that arrangement only operated for a couple of years. At which point, somebody else took it over. And the Alabama was sitting here in Holland, Michigan, because those ships had their winter solstice or winter hibernation in Holland, where they were repaired, worked on, and all this sort of thing. But after a couple of years, the other ones traveled, and the Alabama just sat in Holland for many years. At one point, the Alabama was sold to another company called the Kirby Line, and it did service up to Isle Royal from the Detroit area. That was not successful. Alabama sat in Holland until 1961. The line sold it off because they were having money troubles, and it was scrapped right there in Holland, but the hull was towed out. You could still see that this says Alabama on it down to Bay City, where it worked as a scow until 1975. So the Alabama in one form or another was around, until about 50 years ago. So interesting history for a ship. Some of the other lines, this was the one Chicagoans would be familiar with, the Georgian Bay line, and that shows all that cruise they took through the lakes. Of course, their ships were white, popular. Even the St. Clair River flows past Detroit, Lake St. Clair to Port Huron, Michigan. A lot of cottages and homes along the river there, and people would always exclaim how beautiful it was to see the North American or South American come through, all lit up with a band playing, people dancing on the deck, and things like that. So this whole history, including the Alabama, really was a part of our culture that we don't have right now. Except for the fact that after all these lines went out of business, you'd have an occasional, to tell you how they ended, finally, and after the D&C line was bought by a businessman from Hamtramck, Michigan, he had an ulterior motive to turn the D&C, Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company, into the Denver and Colorado Trucking Company. So he obtained the assets of the company, but then sold everything off so that he could invest in trucks and that truck line. Moved to Denver and all that. So there still was a D&C line. I think it still exists, but it's just a trucking company. But there was the first accident that the D&C ever experienced with passengers on board happened after that changeover in management, and a Norwegian freighter rammed the city of Cleveland 3 in Lake Huron, and people were killed. And 5 people from Benton, it was going on a junket from Benton Harbor to Detroit to see a Tigers game and have a cruise and enjoy the life on board for a couple of days as well, for the Chamber of Commerce. Of course, some of the others, both the Greater Buffalo and the C&B, which we saw in the video, were turned into these trading aircraft carriers that we talked about, and the gentleman in the back there has some personal experience of that he's talked to people about, which is great. Eventually, that city of Cleveland was just towed to the docks in Windsor, Ontario, and it burned. The hull was scrapped in 1950. The other ones of these Detroit lines now, Goodrich was a little different. The ships either sunk or they still had an intact fleet when they went out of business, but other people bought this one, that one, tried to operate it. Some of it was successful. For many years there was the City of Grand Rapids ship that was built by Graham and Morton that still did Great Lakes day cruises out of Chicago for a long time. But one of the captains of the Greater Detroit, on the last 2 of the ships that were in Detroit at the dock that weren't scrapped were the Greater Detroit and the Eastern states. And they sat there for 6 years, from 1950 to 1956. In the meanwhile, the flagship City of Detroit 3 was scrapped. They got that Gothic room out of it. But the company that had bought them from Kolowich, the guy that owned the line, said that it was too expensive to scrap them on site like that, even though you could, while the scrapping was going on, they would put all the paintings, all the furniture out on the dock. You could go and bargain and buy furnishings from the City of Detroit 3. The last 2 had they had their own special fate concocted for them. I find this both terrifying and sad at the same time. When it happened that those 2 ships were going to be immolated, let's say, the plan was to burn them in the middle of Lake St. Clair. The captain said, "I remember the day that the Greater Detroit arrived. It was a great day for Detroit. I saw her then in her day of triumph. I guess that was about 1924 or 1925 when they were launched. But it was sad to see her hauled off like a dead cat by the tail." So they towed these ships from the dock, where I showed you that intermodal system, towed them into Lake St. Clair off the coast of the very, very Tony Grosse Points there. And people would say, "Come downtown, there's a spectacular show. Fireworks, all this on a cold, frigid December night." And they were burned right in the water there, to burn off all the wood, all the furnishings, whatever was left inside, and the hulls were towed away after. Compare that to the fate of the Alabama that was just slowly dismantled into a scow and operated. The hull lived for a long time. In 2009, we took a trip to Switzerland, and on Lake Lucerne, the hotel receptionist suggested to me that we go on one of their fleet of historic steamships. And if you look at that picture with the mountains and the beautiful crystal clear water, those ships all look quite pristine, don't they? Because they're maintained. The dining room on those where we had a little bite to eat, carved wood paneling, very elegant, not a single piece of graffiti, not a scratch on anything. Because and it's very much like the museum. It's not really a company that's operating them. It's a society of friends of the steamships that they do fundraising. They make it possible for the actual lake boat line to operate these historic steamships. So I was really struck by that. We don't have it anymore, but they do. in Switzerland, and in France, and in Italy, and in Germany, and all over. Today there are 7 cruise lines on the Great Lakes that are operating. This is the SS Victory 1, or MS Victory 1, which is the more traditional looking of these Great Lakes cruise ships. However, they're very, very expensive. 6-day cruise, $10,000 and above. So we've taken Viking cruises, which is operating on the Great Lakes. We've taken them in Europe, and they're not that expensive. It's a good value for your dollar. But here, for some reason, the laws and all that make it that way. But it's good to see that people can experience this once again in a different way. And these are motor vessels. They're very modern, but it would have been nice if something had been preserved. If you're ever in Kingston, Ontario, one of the Canadian ships that operated on Lake Huron was called the Keewatin. It was a museum ship after it was retired in 1966. It was actually built in Glasgow, Scotland, made its way across the lake, where in Montreal it was cut in half. There were two exact same ships cut in half, but this was all a planned operation. And each piece was taken through the Welland Canal, which was small at the time. And they went to Buffalo, they were towed to Buffalo and put back together, and those ships served for something like, they were started in 1907, the service finished in 1966 due to insurance laws because of tragedies and this and that, and they lasted all that time, and one is completely preserved in its exact Edwardian splendor at the museum, the Canadian Museum of the Great Lakes in Kingston, Ontario. So if you're ever out that way, I think that would be a very interesting thing. After you heard this lecture, maybe enjoyed my book, you could see it firsthand. That's the only example, really, aside from the Gothic room, that remains of this. Unfortunately, in Chicago, nothing really, it was 1932 when Goodrich ended, so there's nothing except for the little Dewey steamship here, which is part of the Alabama that made it as well. So that's the gist of this whole thing. I've tried to gear this lecture toward the Alabama and the stuff, but I wanted to give you a background of how everything started, the whole complete story. It's just a teaser, really, for all the things that lie within. What I didn't talk about were the wonderful, maybe about Beatrice Bolte, but the wonderful stories of people. Like even in my home of Detroit, there's a great story that I read in a journal. Everybody took this day trip on the boblo boats to go to the amusement park. Well, this guy took his son and a friend down, and they got on the steamship. They thought it was the boblo boat, the SS St. Clair, or one of the two that went that way. And they noticed when they were getting on the boat that people were carrying suitcases. And they thought, well, that's funny. Nobody would ever take a suitcase to Boblo because it's just, there's no hotel, it's just an amusement park. Well, they got on the wrong boat. They got on the South American by accident. They didn't realize it until the boat went sailing right past Buffalo. And the father begged the parents, the captain, to give him a lifeboat so he could row it ashore because they didn't want to go all the way to the next stop, which was Buffalo. And they did some communications so that the family knew where they were. And the son's friend was able to wire his mother that, well, it's been a disaster. You know, we don't know when we're going to get off, and I have no idea when I'm going to be home. But the ship paid for their train trip home the next day. So the little kid, just wanted to make a bigger deal out of it and scare the bejesus out of his mother. So unfortunately, that's how that goes. But there's tons of stories like that. I think it's very entertaining as well, the human aspect that I talked about. So I would really like to thank you very much for taking the time out on a lousy afternoon to come and listen to me talk. And I hope it's been enjoyable for you. I hope that the stories are compelling enough that you felt like you spent some good time here. And again, I'd like to thank you for